Alright, this is Numbers 35 in the Prager Rational Bible. Let's begin. Verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses in the steeps of Moab at the Jordan near Jericho, saying, Instruct the people to assign out of the holdings appointed to them towns for the Levites to dwell in. You shall also assign to the Levites pasture lands around their towns. So, unlike the other tribes, the Levites did not have their own land, since they were to be preoccupied with the tabernacle and the ritual life of the Israelites. Land was apportioned to them in the territory of each tribe, but that land remained under the ownership of the host tribe. It's generally good for a society to have certain individuals assigned to holy service. They remind the general population about the holy. Their effectiveness can be seen in our everyday. People tend to behave better in the presence of clergy. For example, they're much less likely to curse in the presence of a rabbi, priest, or minister. And then verse 3. The town shall be theirs to dwell in, and the pasture shall be for the cattle they own and all their beasts. Alright, verse 4. The town that you are to assign the Levites shall extend 1,000 cubits outside the town wall around. So 1,000 cubits is approximately 1,500 feet. So approximately 500 meters. And of course less than a mile, because a mile is 5,280 feet. Alright, verse 5, you shall measure off 2,000 cubits outside of the town on the east side, 2,000 on the south side, and on the west side, on the north side, with the town in the center. And that shall be the pasture for their towns. So verses 4 and 5 seem to be contradictory. Verse 4 speaks of 1,000 cubits, and verse 5 speaks of 2,000 cubits. It's a little footnote. And I should note that Rashi, citing the Talmud, did offer an explanation. The inner 1,000 was for the open area, the outer 1,000 was for fields and vineyards. Okay. So, yeah, Nachmanides, or Ramban, offered another plausible explanation. The 2,000 cubit measurement refers to the perimeter of the pasture land. In addition, Jacob Milgram offers this explanation. The reference to 1,000 cubits refers to the distance from the center of territory to the center of the territory's border. So the reference 2,000 on the east, south, west, and north sides refers to the distance measured at the border from corner to corner on each side of the territory. And if one rejects either of these explanations, I cite Ronald B. Allen's view, where he said, we may observe that the juxtapositioning of these verses suggests that for the ancients there must have been a workable solution to what seems to us to be a considerable problem. And if these verses were separated by a large block of material, one might argue that they are possibly contradictory, and it was careless on the part of the scribes or redactors not to see how they do not mold together. Since they are adjacent, they must work, or the work of the writer or redactor was most careless indeed. Yeah. And I don't think it was. In other words, Allen is saying that the Israelites knew exactly what the Torah meant and they saw no contradiction. Yeah, and I don't either. And I think those are some good explanations. Alright, here's a little essay. At least it's not a super long essay. Alright, cities of refuge, which are another moral innovation of the Torah. So verse 6, the towns that you assign to the Levites shall comprise the 6 cities of refuge you are to designate for a manslayer to flee to which you shall add 42 towns. So it is in keeping with the Torah's view of homicide that one of the first rules concerning the settlement in the land of Israel dealt with homicide. In the regards of the taking of human life, no matter what the circumstance is seen as a serious and as an extremely serious act. And this is why an ox that gores a human being to death is to be put to death. That's Exodus 21:28. The animal is not killed because it is morally responsible. Obviously it's not. Nor because it needs to be punished, and not because it's deemed to be inordinately dangerous to human beings. It may not be. The human may have done something to provoke the animal. The animal is killed solely because it took human life. And likewise, the Torah commands that an elaborate communal ritual explained in Deuteronomy 21, verses 1 through 8, be enacted when the body of a human being who was killed is found. The community nearest to the corpse needs to address the issue of a homicide in its vicinity. In addition, the Torah prescribes the death penalty for murder when premeditated in all 5 books of the Torah. The punishment is the only punishment found in all 5 books. And some references: Genesis 9:6, Exodus 21:12, and then of course one of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not murder. And then Leviticus 24:17 and Numbers 35:16. Which I'll get to. And then, of course, Deuteronomy 19:11 through 13. In fact, when God sets down the fundamental universal moral principles after the flood, taking the life of a murderer is one of those principles. Genesis 9:6, you shed man's blood, and by man blood shall be shed. And therefore, even when a human being unintentionally kills another human being in a way that devolves some degree of negligence, though the killer is not put to death, he is to flee to one of these cities of refuge to protect him from the vengeance seeking relatives of the accidentally killed person. But that is not the only reason. He's to enter a city of refuge because he's not permitted to go on with his life as if nothing ever happened. And according to Planowski, unintentional killing is punishable by exile only if it happened through negligence. But if the killing occurred as a result of actions of the victim, or for random reasons completely beyond one's control, exile to a city of refuge does not apply. And Jonathan Sacks explains the need for cities of refuge, the moral advance they therefore represented. So in early societies, especially non-urban ones, they lacked an extensive police force, and there was always the danger that people would take the law into their own hands, in particular when a family member of their family or tribe had been killed. And it would begin the cycle of vengeance and retaliation that basically had no natural end. One revenge killing led to another and another until the community had been decimated, a phenomenon familiar to us from literature. And some examples would be from the families of the Montagues and the Capulets from Romeo and Juliet. And then, of course, the movie version of that came out in the 60s, the musical West Side Story, with those two gangs, the Sharks and the Jets. Yep, and then of course the lovers were on either side. Yep. And then also The Godfather, you had the Corleones and the, yeah, yeah, and then you had the Corleones, yeah, gonna make them an offer he can't refuse. Yep, and the Tattaglias. Oh yeah, they try to take out the Godfather in the movie. Yeah, and so you start to have the war between the families. And then I remember Michael, the son, takes out the guys that tried to take out his father, and so he has to flee afterwards. Yeah, it's pretty bad. Yeah, and I've seen those, and I shouldn't have. Ultimately, there's so much sin in these, so I don't recommend them. But I just remember those, unfortunately. But the point is, basically, you see just the rivaling families, going after each other, basically, or groups killing each other, basically. Once you begin the process of wanting to get even because you took out somebody in the family. But basically, yeah, but the person, even if you killed them by accident, of course they would flee to the city of refuge. But you may have the blood avenger still tracking them down. But the good thing maybe about the city of refuge, it's to prevent such situations of blood. It was to prevent such situations of blood vengeance, like in these cases, that the cities of refuge were established. Those who had committed manslaughter were sent there so long as they were within the city limits, they were protected by law. Yeah. And verse 7. Thus the total of towns that you shall assign to the Levites shall be 48 towns with their pasture. So Bolonsky, he notes, why were the Levite cities chosen to be cities of refuge rather than regular cities that belonged to the 12 tribes? Well, this had to do with the Levites' educational function. By living among the Levites, a tribe was fully dedicated to the communication with the Almighty. An unintentional killer could find correction, maybe even salvation. Although the killing happened unintentionally, correction is needed because there was negligence involved. Yep. In assigning towns from the holdings of the Israelites, take more from the larger groups and less from the smaller, so that each assigns towns to the Levites in proportion to the share that it receives. And the Lord spoke further to Moses, saying, Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall provide yourselves with places to serve as your cities of refuge, to which a manslayer who killed a person unintentionally may flee. And these cities shall serve as a refuge from the avenger, so that the manslayer does not die unless he has stood trial before the assembly. So the avenger is an individual who seeks to avenge the life of a family member who was killed by the taking of the life of his relative's killer. And according to Allen, note that the text does not demand that a relative act as a blood avenger. It simply assumes that in the culture, taking such an action was precisely what would be done. And as a result, given the ethos of time, the provision of the cities of asylum was also merciful and righteous. Yeah. And now, of course, today, unfortunately, many people, especially who can come to the U.S., can take advantage of the system by claiming asylum, that they're fleeing oppression from country, and sometimes that could be true, but sometimes it may not be true. Yep. So, again, it's good to help out neighbors, but again, law and order, proper justice, needs to happen ultimately. Yep. Yep. And if you come here, you better do it legally, and you better come to work and assimilate. Otherwise, don't come. Yep. And Jacob Milgram notes that while the institution of asylum is found in other ancient law codes, only the Torah limits asylum solely to the unintentional manslayer. In other societies, every person who murdered intentionally could find asylum in the temple, in a temple, sorry. Yeah, you had the temple, it wasn't built yet. But that's something that the Torah expressly forbids. Exodus 21:14. And the towns that you thus assign shall be 6 cities of refuge in all. 3 cities shall be designated beyond the Jordan, and the other 3 shall be designated in the land of Canaan. They shall serve as the cities of refuge. And these 6 cities shall serve the Israelites and the resident aliens among them for refuge, so that anyone who kills a person unintentionally may flee there. It's remarkable that the resident alien had the same right to flee to a city of refuge, and this meant that a non-Jew who unintentionally killed a Jew had the same right to be protected from vengeful relatives as did a Jew. Joshua 20 verse 9. When homicide is deemed intentional, which of course homicide is just taking a human life, and if it's intentional homicide, then it's murder. But if it's accidental, unintentional, then it's manslaughter. Alright, verses 16 through 21. Verse 16, Anyone, however, who strikes another with an iron object so that death results is murder. The murderer must be put to death. Must. If he struck him with a stone tool so that it could cause death, and death resulted, he's a murderer, and the murderer must be put to death. Similarly, if the object with which he struck him was a wooden tool that could cause death, and death resulted, he is a murderer, and the murderer must be put to death. The blood avenger himself shall put the murderer to death. It is he who shall put him to death upon encounter. So the Hebrew word translated here as avenger, goel, however you say that, it literally means redeemer. And the avenger, however, is not permitted to go and kill the murderer on his own. As Milgram notes, the verdict of deliberate or involuntary homicide is made by the state, not by the bereaved kinsman. And in the ancient Near East, the blood of the slain human was being avenged by the nearest kinsman, usually by taking the blood of the slayer or of a member of the slayer's family. But in contrast, the Torah's language in this verse makes it clear that only the guilty party is subject to retribution, and no other member of his family may be slain in his place. And so, too, if he pushed him in hate or hurled something at him on purpose and death resulted, or if he struck him with his hand in enmity and death resulted, the assailant shall be put to death. He is a murderer. The blood avenger shall put the murderer to death upon encounter. Now, when homicide is deemed unintentional, verse 22. But if he pushed him without malice, afterthought, or hurled any object at him unintentionally, or inadvertently dropped upon him any deadly object of stone, and death resulted, though he was not an enemy of his and did not seek his harm, in such cases the assembly shall decide between the slayer and the blood avenger. So, as noted, a person who killed someone unintentionally is protected by fleeing to a city of refuge. But while the city of refuge protects the unintentional killer from being killed by a next of kin avenger, remaining in a city of refuge is nevertheless a form of punishment when negligence is involved. And the Torah provides two examples of unintentional homicide with negligence: killing a person by hurling any object or dropping a stone, provided the person bore no prior malice towards the victim. And according to most ancient Near Eastern law codes, family members of a slain individual were permitted to take justice into their own hands. In contrast, the Torah maintains a court is responsible for delivering a verdict of deliberate or involuntary homicide. Only if the court determines the killing was intended is the avenger permitted to execute the murderer. The Torah thus ended vengeance killing in Israel. And the assembly shall protect the manslayer from the blood avenger. The assembly shall restore him to the city of refuge to which he fled, and he shall remain there until the death of the high priest who was anointed with the sacred oil. So the word used here to describe the accidental manslayer is Rashizak, however you say that, which is the noun of the Hebrew verb for murder, which is rashak, the word used in the sixth commandment. Thou shalt not murder. And the use of this word suggests that the Torah regards unintentional killing as a form of murder. Thus, to use a contemporary example, a drunk driver who accidentally kills someone would be deemed a murderer, though not liable to the death penalty, even though the driver did not intend to take a human life. And on the other hand, a train engineer who, unlike the drunk driver, is at no way at fault for killing a person, such as if a person chose to commit suicide by jumping in front of the moving train, that engineer is not deemed a murderer and is not punished. That is, he does not need to live in a city of refuge. But of course, life's still taken, even if it's not done intentionally. But if the manslayer ever goes outside of the limits of the city of refuge to which he has fled, and the blood avenger comes upon him outside of the limits of the city of refuge, the blood avenger kills the manslayer, then there's no blood guilt on his part. The role of the death of the high priest. For he must remain inside a city of refuge until the death of the high priest, and after the death of the high priest, the manslayer may return to his landholding. So the individual who killed a human being unintentionally, but due to negligence, was uprooted from his home and community and confined to a city of refuge where his family could join him and where he could still practice his profession, but he remained there until the death of the high priest. And the Talmud recounts that the mother of the high priest would sew beautiful clothing and bake fresh bread for all the inhabitants of a city of refuge, so that they would not pray for her son's death. And that is in the Talmud, and it comes from Mishnah Mekot 2:6. Okay. Now, why was the manslayer allowed to leave a city of refuge when the high priest died? We don't know for sure, but there are at least two plausible reasons. First, the death of the high priest signified a new era, one in which the slate was wiped clean, so to speak. And the death of the high priest was deemed a national tragedy in ancient Israel. It therefore affected all the Israelites in such a profound way that the family of someone unintentionally killed would be prepared to forego their desire to avenge that family's death. And even when they were not so prepared, they had no choice. And with the death of the high priest, God ordered them to cease seeking vengeance. And second, the death of the high priest in some way atoned for the death of the individual who was unintentionally killed. It was the blood of the murderer that atoned for the murder. But whose blood atoned for the death of someone who was inadvertently but negligently killed? The blood of the high priest. And that was understood by families seeking vengeance for the death of their next kin. And then, of course, the ultimate high priest died on the cross for our wrongdoing. Yeah, but he rose from the grave, and we should find refuge in him. So the ultimate avenger, which he'll come back as an avenger on those who rebelled against him. Yeah, take refuge in him. Yeah, that way, yeah, we will not ultimately be slain by him who's the ultimate avenger. Yep. Yep, vengeance is the Lord's, as Romans 12 says. Yep. But anyway, such shall be your law of procedure throughout the ages and all your settlements, and if anyone kills a person, the manslayer may be executed only on the evidence of witnesses. The testimony of a single witness against a person shall not suffice for a sentence of death. So once again, the Torah emphasizes that that only one who murders deliberately is to be executed, and only on the testimony of two witnesses. And some modern commentators argue that since it is quite rare for two people to witness a murder, this is the Torah's way of implying that it opposes, this is the Torah's way of implying that it opposes capital punishment, that while the death penalty shall remain on the books, it should rarely, if ever, be enforced. Yeah, that's what some of the modern commentators say. But if the Torah opposes capital punishment for murder, why would it mandate the death sentence for murder in each of its 5 books, the only law that's found in all 5 books? And I gave some of those verses earlier. The answer is obvious. The Torah is adamant that one who deliberately takes the life of an innocent person is to be deprived of his own life. God says so near in the beginning of Genesis. Because it's a foundational rule of civilization. And therefore, the reason the Torah states a murderer can be put to death only on the testimony of 2 eyewitnesses is to ensure as legitimate a convocation as possible beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to make absolutely sure that the person really is guilty of murder. Yeah. Alright, one final essay. Why a murderer cannot be ransomed. You may not accept a ransom for the life of a murderer who was guilty of a capital crime. He must be put to death. No amount of money can be paid to ransom the life of a murderer. There are at least 3 reasons for this prohibition. First, if a murderer's life could be ransomed, it would give the wealthy or those with wealthy friends, family, an enormous unfair advantage. Poor murderers would be put to death, while wealthy murderers could escape the death penalty. And second, a convicted murderer buying his way out of the death penalty would insult the murdered. It would devalue his life and greatly reduce the enormity of the crime. In his code of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides makes this very point. One should take care not to take ransom from a murderer, even if he gives all the money in the world, and even if the blood avenger wishes to let him go free. The soul of the victim is not the property of the blood avenger, but the property of God. And that's Moses, Maimonides, Laws of Murder and Preservation of Life, 1:4. All right, that's the last footnote citation in the book. There you go. And third, even if the murderer or some wealthy family member or friend promised to give as ransom an enormous sum of money to the poor, the Torah forbids it. The Torah is preoccupied with justice, not social justice. Whereas social justice would celebrate a major contribution to the poor, that would also undermine justice. A murderer who should be executed, would be allowed to keep his life if social justice was the ultimate thing. And that would actually constitute an injustice. Those who oppose capital punishment for murder offer a number of arguments. The two chief ones are an innocent person might be executed, and society, in their view, though clearly not in the Torah's view, does not have the right to take a murderer's life. But the argument they cannot offer is that it is just that someone who is maliciously deprived an innocent person of his life may be allowed to keep his own. Indeed, it's harder to imagine such a great injustice. The Torah is preoccupied with justice. You can see the essay, The Death Penalty for Murder is a Moral Cornerstone of Society, Genesis 9:6. And of course, Jesus told Peter, after Peter cut off that guy's ear, as Jesus was being arrested, Jesus said, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. Yep. In this regard, too, the Torah differed from other ancient Near Eastern law codes, where a murderer's life could be ransomed if the victim's family agreed to it. And the clearest way a society communicates the severity of a crime is by the punishment it prescribes for that crime. The Torah, in prescribing capital punishment for murder, affirms that there's no greater crime than taking the life of an innocent human being. And also, I remember on a Larry King episode, John MacArthur and Dennis Prager were both on that one. It was a Christmas one, talking about who was Jesus, along with some other guys. But towards the end of it, Dennis tries to basically make the point that you can read the same text, but you can arrive at different conclusions. And then he brings up the example of capital punishment. For example, we start with this panelist, John Meacham. Are you pro or anti-capital punishment? I'd really not say, okay, John MacArthur, are you pro or anti-capital punishment? Yeah, I'm pro-capital punishment. I think the Bible clear. And then Catholic sitting there said he was anti-capital punishment. Yep, and by the way, I agree with John MacArthur's position. Yeah, it's the only command in all 5 books of the Torah. Yeah, whoever sheds man's blood, by man, his blood shall be shed. That's a command of God. Yeah. So, I just like that, because that's one of the few times that Dennis and John agreed. Because, of course, they didn't agree about Jesus being God. Yeah, I would ask this to Dennis. You say that he was a great moral teacher. What about whenever he says in John, before Abraham was, I am? Well, I don't necessarily believe that he said those things. I don't know that. That's entirely faith on your part or whatever. Yeah, because of course he doesn't believe in the New Testament. Yep. Yeah. But he does believe in the Old Testament. Yeah, well, so do I. So we have that in common. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there since it's almost Christmas and this talk of capital punishment, and I just remembered that little conversation. And that's really one of the only times I've ever seen them together, so that was nice. Yeah, it's a good video, so I'll probably put it in the description. Yep. Alright, verse 32. Nor may you accept ransom in lieu of flight to a city of refuge, enabling one to return to live on his homeland before the death of the priest. So just as the life of a convicted murderer may not be ransomed, so too those who killed unintentionally but as a result of negligence cannot be redeemed, but they must flee to the city of refuge. Bloodshed pollutes the land. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and the land can have no atonement for blood that's shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. And you shall not defile the land in which you live, in which I myself abide, for I, the Lord, abide among the Israelite people. So Richard Elliott Friedman writes this: human violence and corruption have consequences not only for their immediate victims and not even only for other humans, but for the condition of earth and nature. Murder is not only a sin against the victim, it's also a sin against the earth, and also, first and foremost, God. And Jacob Milgram notes that the idea that blood pollutes the land is found in Genesis 4:10, where God tells Cain that the voice of the bloods of his murdered brother are crying out to me from the earth. And as explained there, bloods, the plural is the literal Hebrew word, and it refers to the blood of Abel and that of all of Abel's descendants who have been deprived of life because of Abel's murder. And as the Israelites were poised to enter the Holy Land, or more precisely the land that is to be made holy, the Torah describes blood that is shed as a result of homicide as polluting. And the only way that a pollution could be remedied was by shedding the blood of the murderer. Or, of course, you do it by accident, then, of course, fleeing to the city of refuge and staying there until the high priest dies. Yep, and if every society in our time regarded homicide as a form of pollution, the world would be a much kinder place. Indeed, if every society regarded homicide as seriously as the Torah demanded ancient Israel regard it, well, then the world would be a beautiful place. Yeah, if only we would see this when it comes to abhorrence and Murder Incorporated, PP. Ay, ay, ay. Yeah, blood cries out of all those babies. Yeah, our land is definitely polluted for that reason and other reasons. Oh boy, no wonder we're under judgment. But hopefully we repent. Especially the modern church. Alright, anyway, moving on. I can get pretty riled up about all this, but I want to try to finish. Alright, but this is how Ronald Allen expresses this thought. With all the attention we rightly give to the issues of ecology and pollution in our day, there is an act of pollution that far transcends the trashing of rivers, killing of lakes, the denuding of forests, which I guess, chopping down all the trees and all that stuff, spilling of oil to mar even in seas. The transcendent pollution is the abuse of persons. The worst abuse of all is to cause wrongful death. And God will not draw near to a land polluted with wrongly shed human blood. And that view of homicide is one of so many reasons the world would incalculably it's hard to say that, improve if it took the Torah seriously. Until then, we'll continue to live in a world in which the statement attributed to Joseph Stalin reigns, and killed like millions of people in Soviet Russia, or he supposedly said this: 1 million deaths are a statistic. Basically, they don't matter. Yeah, and of course, under communism, really, you don't view people as being made in the image of God. Yeah, and you can just take people out when you feel like it, or when you feel like they're a threat, or whatever. And ultimately, you take out Christians first and foremost, because you don't want God to be God. You want to be God. You want government to be God. Yep. But as horrible as, like, the action of murder is, well, the ultimate horrible thing that I think is missed here is murder spiritually. Spiritual murder. And that comes from people that are claiming to be of God, but yet they deceive people with lies about God. And they ultimately lead people to hell. They're murdering people spiritually. And sadly, when we don't call that stuff out, we're basically letting it happen. Yep. Yep. So that's the other worst type of murder, I would say. Yeah, doing it spiritually with lies and deceptions in the name of God. There's probably more evil than the physical act of murder in and of itself. Yep. Yep. So, may the Lord help us to obey the commands, and hopefully our country would repent of its bloodshed that's definitely polluted the land, especially with abhorrence. Yep. And I just ask these things in your Son's name. And Lord willing, I'll finish up the book of Numbers in chapter 36 another time. But until then, may God bless you in the grace and mercy won by Jesus, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all.